everyone. I'm Karen Bordelot, the new executive editor of the New Bedford Light, and on behalf of our team, I am really happy to welcome you here today to the community conversation. So tonight's conversation will examine the Massachusetts ballot question 2, the referendum on whether the MCAS test should continue to be a requirement for high school graduation. This is the 5th of 6 community conversations this year, all designed to provide you with a 360-degree view of critical issues that face the city. For us at The Light, these sessions are a face-to-face form of journalism and another platform on which to fulfill our mission, which is to expose, to examine, to educate, and to engage. I now have the pleasure of introducing Colin Hogan, one of the Light's star reporters, as the moderator for tonight's event. Colin, who joined the Light in June of 2022, covers education, child care, city government, and many other subjects. Before the Light, Colin worked as a public school teacher in the Mississippi Delta region and in Brooklyn, New York. He's a native of New Yorker, and he has a bachelor's degree in English from Williams College, a master's degree in education from Johns Hopkins University, and a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University.
Thank you very much. Everyone, we're very excited by our new editor, Karen Bordelot, so please give her another round of applause. And as she mentioned, this is a community conversation series, and we're very excited to have you here this evening to learn about MCAS and the ballot question 2 that you'll be voting on maybe as soon as tomorrow. Early voting has begun. Our conversation this evening is going to be 45 minutes or so of me asking questions to our panelists. They'll have the chance to respond to each other, a moderated discussion about how they've come to their opinions. They're experts in their fields. And at the end, we greatly encourage you to be thinking of questions along the way. You'll have more than enough time for questions and answers about what they say, what their experience is, or about questions you have if you're still deciding how to vote on this issue. I'm going to introduce our panel now. Starting from the far end is Cynthia Roy. Cynthia is a professional educator with nearly 2 decades of experience teaching diverse students and developing curricula at the secondary and post-secondary levels. As a community organizer with the New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools and a union leader with the Massachusetts Teachers Association, she manages grassroots campaigns, drives community-based initiatives, and shapes education policy. Dr. Roy is also a researcher and opinion leader with a focus on advocating for justice and equity in education. She is the recipient of several awards, including the Commonwealth Heroine Award in 2022 from the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women. Welcome, Cynthia. I don't mean to be unfair, but actually let's hold our applause to the end so I can get through their introductions. Next, we have Peter Piazza, an assistant professor at the College of Education, University of Massachusetts Amherst. His bio reads, Peter is an assistant research professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and co-leads the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Educational Assessment, a coalition of public K-12 districts piloting a non-test-based form of school quality measurement. Peter is also an active member of the National Coalition on School Diversity, and he writes about race and school integration at the School Diversity Notebook blog. He's also the parent of 2 children who attend the Malden Public Schools. Welcome, Peter. Next is Carrie Rodriguez. Carrie, called arguably the most successful parent, organizer, and education advocacy today. Carrie's outstanding commitment to social, economic, and educational equity for children and families spans decades. She serves on the U.S. Department of Education's National Parent and Family Engagement Council, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, the Children's Equity Project Family Advisory Committee at Arizona State University, and was elected to the Massachusetts Democratic State Committee. Her work, impact, and perspective has been featured in the New York Times, NBC Nightly News, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox News, The Washington Post, Politico, The Boston Globe, among others. In 2022, the National Parents Union was honored as the National Advocate of the Year by Unidos US. Carrie's been recognized as the Change Agent of the Year by Education Reform Now, a 2024 National Education Champion by the United States Department of Education, and recently received the Castle Caregiver Award for Outstanding National Leadership in Social and Emotional Learning. Welcome, Carrie. And nearest to me is Ed Lambert. Ed's public service includes 12 years as the mayor of Fall River, 7 years as a state representative, and 20 years on the Fall River School Committee. As mayor, he worked on numerous initiatives, including improving and building numerous schools and establishing the state's first bioreserve, which has protected 14,000 acres of forest and wetlands. Ed was founding director of the Urban Initiative of UMass Dartmouth, a research center focused on urban policy issues and providing technical assistance to communities and organizations throughout Massachusetts. He helped to form the Gateway Cities Coalition, which includes a number of cities whose mayors are working to revitalize their communities with the support of the state legislature. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology at Southeastern Massachusetts University, now UMass Dartmouth, and his Master of Education in Counseling at Bridgewater State College. Could you give a round of applause to our entire panel, please? We are thrilled that all of you could join us here. To start, I was going to let everyone here know where a lot of you stand on this. You've done some advocacy work, but I thought it'd probably be better for you to tell them yourselves. We're going to go down the panel really quickly, and in 1 minute or less, as if a neighbor or friend was coming to ask you how they should vote on this question. And they were on their way to the polls, and they said, you do that education stuff. How are you voting on this, and why? So really quickly, Cindy, how are you voting on this and why?
I am voting yes on 2, and I'll sum it up by saying that I teach at a vocational school, and during the senior year, students write a research paper and they develop a product relevant to their trade. They, at the end of the year, defend this product to a panel of educators and parents and industry experts. Every essential skill that we would want a student to graduate high school with is assessed through this process. So I don't see why a student who has passed all of their coursework based on the state standards and gone through this capstone project, why they should then have to pass a standardized test to graduate high school, a test that cannot capture what they know and can do.
Thank you. Peter, I'm on my way to the polls. How are you voting and why?
First of all, I just want to thank the New Bedford Light for having us here. This is such a fantastic venue for this conversation. So I am excited to vote yes on 2 in a few weeks, as it were. I am focused on the 700 or so students who are denied a diploma each year, and that number is expected to increase, as well as the countless others who drop out of high school before they reach that point. And I think a yes on 2 vote is an important first step towards getting a better option for those students, towards an accountability system that is a more accurate and a more fair representation of what they know and they can do. So those students, especially as the number of English language learners skyrockets across Massachusetts, those students are my main concern. That said, I believe that a yes on 2 vote will improve the learning experiences for all students in the Commonwealth, and I can say more about that during the conversation.
Carrie, how about you? How are you voting and why?
My most important title is always being Matthew, Miles, and David's mom. That's why I do work in education justice, and that's how I answer this question. So I am absolutely voting no on question 2 because of the fact that I have a kid who has special needs, who attends a therapeutic high school in Massachusetts, and this was a child who 30 years ago we would have given up on. He has autism and special needs, and he has an extensive IEP and needs this therapeutic setting. And this is a kid who, in the past, we would have taught life skills and would have taught how to make pizza boxes. And Matthew is absolutely capable of not just proficiency, but excellence. So much so that, last year, as a 10th grader, when he had to pass the MCAS exam, he did. Did he have to take the math portion twice? absolutely. But kids like mine are worth investing in. And the MCAS provides me as a parent with actionable data that gives me what I need to take the steps necessary to get my child the resources that he needs, to make sure that the teachers in the schools have what they need, and that we have resource equity in schools, and that if we need to remediate the system, we know where to move. Without data, we cannot just decide based on a vibe how to allocate resources effectively so we can make sure that children in the Commonwealth actually get their constitutionally protected right to access to a high-quality education.
And Ed, how are you voting and why?
Thanks. Thank you for the, wow. Thank you for the light for this opportunity. I've already voted no and want to encourage others to do the same. I represent currently an organization called the Mass Business Alliance for Education that 30 years ago worked with teachers, with parents, with legislators in a nonpartisan way to pass legislation that advanced education in Massachusetts from about the middle of the pack to first of the nation. And the reason it did was because we coupled funding, which was absolutely necessary, to equalize educational opportunity in places like Fall River and New Bedford, with significant reforms that raised expectations and led us to believe that every student can achieve. And since we've done that, graduation rates have gone up, dropout rates have gone down, and student achievement has increased for all student groups and students collectively. It's been a success, which you don't often find in public policy, but in this case, the data show that it has worked. It's really important to keep that universal statewide standard, because without it, we will have none. And we will return to a time when 330 different school districts will have their own definition of what a high school diploma can be. And I can speak from firsthand experience, having served on my school committee, that the expectations are different if they're left from one local district to the next, that they, whether we agree with it or not, are often lower for kids based on their zip code, their color, their race, their language, their disability or ability, and the like. Having that standard, as Secretary of Education Pat Tutwiler has said, is important because the kids will be harmed most if we eliminate it without a replacement. And we're going to hear alternatives tonight, and I understand, but those alternatives are not on the ballot. This question not only removes the use of this exam as a graduation requirement, it prohibits the use of any statewide or district-wide assessment. And so nothing replaces it, and we will go back to a time when we had serious inequity in our schools. So I'm encouraging people to vote no.
So you've heard from each of the panelists about where they stand and how they're voting. That's going to inform our conversation. I have questions for each of you about how you've come to your positions and your experience. Cindy, I want to start with you. You're a teacher. You said you were coming from school today, Bristol Plymouth Regional. Again, the first question, I'd like to actually task you with sort of explaining a little bit more to folks about MCAS if they're not familiar. You've written that it changes how you prepare for your classroom, but could you also just tell us some facts about the test? It's administered online these days, right? What's it like for you as a teacher going in there, having this test, and what's it actually like for people who might not be familiar with how it's administered?
I would love to answer that question, but I'm also dying to respond to what they said. Can I do that?
Yeah.
I think this is really important. They said some things that I think as an educator needs to be addressed. So first of all, let's be clear that neither the state standards nor the MCAS go away with this question. We're strictly talking about eliminating the graduation requirement. And what I think might not be clear to the audience and maybe everyone up here is that the state standards are the basis of our entire curriculum. So what I teach, the lessons I develop, they're based on our state standards. The progression of topics I cover, the core courses offered are based on these standards. Teacher preparation programs, teacher evaluation systems, our professional development based on the standards. Like literally everything happening in our schools across the state are based on these standards, and they don't go away. It is, I know, Kara, you had said based on a vibe, and so I really want to address that because it's absolutely not based on a vibe. Educators are assessing students in various ways every day. We assess our students through what we call formative and summative assessments, and we assess our students through multiple means of expression. So what that means is we know that there's many ways for students to demonstrate what they know to us. Students can demonstrate what they know through a variety of writing exercises, orally, through a variety of speaking exercises. They can build models, they can do performance-based assessments. I could go on. But educators are assessing student mastery on the state standards every single day. And honestly, the MCAS exam can't do what we can do. The research literature shows us, and I'm sure Peter will also can attest to this, that standardized tests are actually not they don't measure what we think they measure. A lot of people think standardized tests are measuring content knowledge and student learning, but actually standardized tests are not great measures of that. They are great measures of poverty, of educational attainment in a family. And so the MCAS exam, right, isn't necessarily a great measure of student learning. And the ELA exam, it actually only addresses 40% of the state standards. Our highly qualified educators are able to assess student learning on these standards, all of the standards, and in a variety of ways. That's something that a standardized test cannot do.
Appreciate you responding to the question. You actually also answered mine. Just to follow up on that a little bit, you spoke about the ways you assess standards. Could you talk a little bit, because I know you've written also what MCAS does for how you prepare now and how you think it would be different between what your preparation is like now versus if MCAS as a graduation requirement were to go away?
Right. So I'll try to be brief because I know I've already taken a lot of time. Unfortunately for educators, instead of using our prep time to develop engaging lessons, to differentiate instruction, to create culturally responsive lessons, we are spending our prep time in MCAS data analysis meetings, and that is the truth. Meetings about how to improve test scores. And let's be honest, taking a test and improving test scores requires very different skills than, say, scientific inquiry skills. They're not the same skills. And so we spend our time in meetings talking about how to boost test scores. And then when we're not doing that, we are spending our prep time covering other classes because we have a teacher shortage, because working under these conditions is incredibly difficult. So what would be different is that instead of teaching to the test, educators will be able to do their job, to create engaging lessons, to instill a love of learning for our students.
Sure. Now, Carrie, I'd like to go to you. You've done a lot of education advocacy over your time, and there are issues on which you agree with the teachers union, times you disagree with the teachers union. There was a profile of you in 2018 in the Commonwealth Beacon where you said, teachers should absolutely have a seat at the table. They should not have every seat at the table. I should have an equal say in what happens to my children. You spoke earlier about how the experience of these tests has seemed beneficial to you as a parent. And I wonder if you could just speak more about how your view as a parent here is different from the teachers union and what you see the value of these tests are.
I think the first thing I want to say is, listen, standards are great. I think they're awesome, but that is an input, and I'm focused on outputs as a parent. If you have standards and you hope that kids are exposed to these standards and then, take in knowledge and they get proficiency, that's wonderful. But we got to check to make sure that proficiency has been achieved. And that is what the MCAS is about. So I will tell you, when I say grades that are based on a vibe and assessment based on a vibe, that actually comes from a conversation that I had with a teacher regarding my 7th grader. Okay, last year, I had a 7th grader sitting in my living room who could not complete a sentence when he was trying to write a book report on Roberto Clemente. And we're looking and we're saying, why is Max struggling with this? Because when I look at his report card, he's getting A's and B's. This is an honor roll kid. Why is he struggling so much? And, again, I'm a parent. I'm not an educator, but I'm married to an educator who also is saying, the data that we're getting from teachers who are assessing him and giving all of these writing assignments and going through all of what you're saying that educators are doing, the math is not mathing here. So what ended up happening is we get the MCAS data back in October and find so many red flags around him not meeting expectations. And every conversation we're having with educators is, no, he's great, he's wonderful, he's a joy to have in class, he has a strong sense of social justice, awesome, I love all of that, but the kid cannot read. And as a parent, they're telling me I'm crazy. So what did we end up doing? We take the MCAS data, we end up going to Sylvan Learning Center to get him a reading and writing assessment to find out that he's 2.5 grade levels behind in reading and in spelling and all of these red flags that were not flagged by teachers. And I'm not that unique. There are parents that we hear from all the time who are struggling to understand why those things don't match up. So again, I think it's very important for us as parents to be able to have that data. But I also question, when you talk about, the environments that we are creating for teachers and children. I also had another experience with my oldest son who just passed the MCAS. I remember him being in 3rd grade, and we all get that email home that says, tomorrow's MCAS, make sure they go to sleep really early, they get a good night's sleep, let's make sure they eat. I would actually argue that that's important every night, and kids should be eating all the time. Like we want kids to be prepared and ready, which is why organizations like mine, we're working with the teachers union around things like breakfast after the bell. But I said to Matt, I said, hey, bud, tomorrow, MCAS, are you ready for this? And I watched his shoulders hit his earlobes. Absolutely frightened. He's in 3rd grade. That's not coming from me. I don't put that pressure on my kid. Who is telling my child that they have to be so terrified of this test that something bad, something terrible is going to happen if you don't get a good grade on MCAS? So I had to have a conversation with Matt and say, you know what, Matt? This is not a big deal, bud. This is like going to the doctor and having your temperature taken, because mom needs to know whether or not you're educationally healthy. Do you need some vitamins? Are you sick? Is there something wrong? Do you need some help? Does your teacher need some help? Does the school need some help? This is just to give mommy some information so that I can be a good helper. But I'm not putting that stress on kids to be terrified of this test. And I would question, why are we creating these environments around this test? I would argue because sometimes we don't like what the data tells us as grown-ups, because it requires us to change, it requires us to shift and do things differently, and maybe confront the fact that we're not doing an adequate job by our kids.
I appreciate that answer, Carrie. You said you were focused on inputs and outputs, and ultimately what a lot of this question comes down to is the best ways that we are ensuring kids are learning. And everyone at this table is arguing for different ways about measuring that learning. So Peter, I think that's a good segue to go to you as a research professor. Could you talk a little bit about what we know about how to assess learning, the outputs for students? Much has been written about how standardized tests are able to assess. Also, grades are another metric. I know that's something that you focus on at the MASS Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. Apologies if I got that wrong, but thank you. Tell me a little bit about how we measure outcomes for students and what we know to be effective.
Well, one thing I'll say is that we know a lot more now than we did 30 years ago. And I commend the work of folks like my colleague here, like Ed, who made some groundbreaking efforts to move Massachusetts forward in 1993. And I don't agree with everything in the 1993 law.
What is the 1993 law?
Sorry, that was the law that gave us MCAS. So quick history lesson, 1993 reform law gave us more funding for schools, as well as the MCAS exam was created in 1993. It was first given in 1998. It was first a graduation requirement in 2003, and it's been a graduation requirement in 2003, since 2003, with the exception of the pandemic years. So, we, as a state policy community and as a nation, have studied the impact of educational exit exams in Massachusetts and nationwide. And we've learned a lot in those 30 years that I think we can apply to make a better accountability system this year. So one thing that Cindy mentioned, the relationship between family income and test score outcomes. Now, a recent analysis of MCAS scores, most recent MCAS scores, puts that correlation at 88%. That means that a family's income explains almost 88% of students' outcomes on an MCAS score. And I think this makes sense, right? That when families can bring their children to the Sylvan Learning Center and supplement their instruction, then they can offer their children opportunities that lower income families simply cannot. And that's why we see a very high correlation. I mean, 88% is as high a correlation as we see in anything in educational research. Now, there's a few other things that we know from the research over the years. We know that states that use multiple measures of student learning see their achievement increase. Now, we said earlier, and I have to respond to something that Ed said in his opening, that student achievement has increased since MCAS was a graduation requirement. Now, I'm going to take you all just for 1 second. If you're willing to go there with me, I'm going to take you all into a very highly cited report on this topic. It's called Lifting All Boats, but it's called Lifting All Boats ? And it is the most extensive analysis of the impact of the MCAS exam and the graduation requirement. It's often cited by folks who will be voting no. As somebody who's voting yes, I find so much in this report that actually further strengthens my feeling about voting yes. And one of those things is that it says that graduation rates, and student achievement rose until about 2008. So remember, it was a graduation requirement in 2003. The report cited by folks who will be voting no says that there was an increase in 2008, and then it's basically leveled off since then. That tells me that we had something that maybe was good. There was also a lot of funding that was driven to schools during that time. But it also tells me that it stopped working. And I think that we need something better.
Ed, go ahead.
Thanks. And let me I want to start my remarks by saying, I usually say this wherever I'm speaking on this topic, but I wanted to make my 1 minute as cogent as possible.
You have more than a minute now.
Oh, great. We should never forget, despite the fact that a number of us who are part of this coalition opposing this question, our disagreement is with the leadership of the teachers union. The fact is that teachers do heroic work every day in classrooms across this Commonwealth. And I want to be clear that we need to cherish that and continue to respect it and hold it up. There's some things that have been said that I just want to kind of quickly just double back on. Dr. Roy had mentioned that the standards will still be there. But the fact of the matter is that we agree, right, that those standards are not required. That Mass Core is a suggested curriculum that districts can use. And a report released just last week showed that only about 50% of districts use it. And they could change it tomorrow. So the fact of the matter is, this is the only, in Massachusetts, this is the only state requirement for graduation, state academic requirement. You do have to take civics and phys ed. You don't have to pass, you have to take it. And we would join Vermont as one of only 2 states nationally without any statewide graduation requirement. So I think it's important to know that. You may choose to use the standards as an individual teacher, but nothing requires you to do that in state law. Nothing requires your district to do that, et cetera, et cetera. With regard to how we assess students, one of the things that we think is very important about using a common assessment to determine whether or not students are ready for college and career, that common assessment that tells parents and families and students that they are ready, is that it is universal across districts, across schools. When you have not only 330 districts with their own standards, but then you have grading policies that are different from one district to the next. You often have grading systems by teachers that are different from one classroom to the next. That lack of uniformity, again, suggests that you've got a multiplicity of ways in which students may or may not be considered ready to go forward. Stephen brought up Peter, sorry. Peter brought up oh yeah, sure, thanks. Peter brought up the PAPE research and the Brown study and the like. There is, and it correlates, never said it was causative, but certainly there is a correlation between students' MCAS scores and outcomes with regard to career and college, right? Okay, so to the point that, well, the test really doesn't measure what we want it to measure. The fact is that the MCAS assessment system is not produced in, at least the content, the standards, and the questions are not produced in New Jersey or Mars. We have educators who come together in Massachusetts, over 200 of them on a fairly regular basis, to determine what the frameworks will be, what the standards will be, and then to avoid a conflict of interest, there's a second set of educators who then come together to determine what the questions should be so that we can assess them. So, you know, I've had an opportunity to discuss this with other union leadership elsewhere, and they say, well, it assesses only maybe 40%. The solution then to that, if you have a problem with what it assesses, is not to eliminate it and not have a common assessment. And that's what the ballot question does. That's the imperfection of using ballot initiatives to set complicated policy. So if I know we're going to, well, I'm sure we'll have some conversation about performance assessment and other things. And listen, as supplements to ensuring that there's a common assessment that guarantees some level of academic achievement, I think all of those things are fine. Nobody's suggesting that the MCAS is even a perfect test or can't be improved. It's been improved, it has evolved, and will continue to be improved. But eliminating it, rather than working together to say, well, what can we do to enhance it? How can we follow the lead of other states that might be using some of these items, I think is important. The notion that it's teaching to the test is really hard to grasp, because it is about teaching those standards that educators in Massachusetts have come together to suggest students should know in order to graduate from high school. So certainly when you have a test that measures that, it's not teaching to the test, it is teaching to those standards, and then the assessment measures that. And then the last thing I do want to say, and I recognize one of the arguments from the teachers union has been, well, look, it only just measures demography. The fact is that, and we've done a lot of this research, you can go from one district to the next, and there are some districts very successfully moving the needle for high need students from economically disadvantaged families and the like. The suggestion that we should scrap the test because certain kids can't pass it, I really think is not what we want to embrace as a policy initiative in the Commonwealth.
Thank you for that, Ed. I saw at the end of the table you wanted to respond. Cindy, is there anything there that you wanted to respond to?
There's so much in that to unpack. And I think that I will just choose to focus on one of the things. It's actually a question. So speaking of teachers union, speaking of union leadership, I am one of those leaders, so you're talking about me. Keep that in mind.
Personal, I just said we disagree.
I know, but when you frame something as like the union, right, or you are talking about educators. You are talking about people in this room, okay? MT is not separate from teachers. We
Cindy,
are the
I appreciate that. But do you want to respond to about the standards?
Right. Yes, it's a question because, and this is why I brought up the MTA thing, is that I work with educators across the state. I represent educators in 60 different locals in this region. I am not aware of schools that do not follow the state standards. I did ask him as well if he was aware. I would like you to actually point out, I'm genuinely curious, because DESE even audits schools to make sure that the curriculum is aligned with the standards. So I genuinely do not know, and I'm wondering if you can tell me.
I'll actually come in here and I'll clarify some of what this is about. Ed mentioned something called MassCore. This is the State Department of Education comes up with a recommended course of curriculum that schools can follow or not. There's no enforcement power, and that course of curriculum is what the state deems as a very high bar for graduating high school. Ed said that, there is no mandatory enforcement that districts must follow this course of curriculum, but that's actually different than the standards that we're talking about. Standards are about courses themselves, and Cindy was saying that all, of her courses follow standards. That's true. When you're teaching Algebra 1 or English, those do have to follow standards. You can't call it an Algebra 1 class if it's not following those standards. You can definitely respond, but there's a difference between the course curriculum over the course of that and standards, and that's what this conversation has been about. Ed, if you'd like to respond to it.
Well, but there's likewise no requirement that the standards be part of the local curriculum.
Can I jump in?
Peter, go ahead.
Sure.
So this is another really important thing that has changed since in the 30 years since we've had Massachusetts education reform. So we have 80-degree days in October now, and we have state accountability, state oversight. I'm not a fan of state oversight in the least, but this state oversight is not on the ballot. And I really want everybody to remember this. This is about the graduation requirement. It is not about the MCAS. The MCAS, like it or not, will still be in place. And in 2010, we passed a law in the state. Again, this is a law that I don't love, but the fact is that it exists. And it didn't exist in 1993. And that law allows the state to review, the state reviews the MCAS scores, and remember, it will have all of those MCAS scores, all of them. That regardless of what happens in question 2, MCAS will be taken. And the state has new oversight powers that it didn't have in 1993. And so it's not really, in my opinion, and this is where I do disagree with Ed, it's not up to an individual educator about whether or not they decide to follow the state standards. Now, I'm married to an educator, and I have worked in Massachusetts schools for the better part of the last 20 years. I have never met an educator who isn't doing their absolute best by students. And I absolutely trust them regardless of state oversight. But even if you don't, and you want some kind of oversight mechanism, it exists. And states and schools will be subject to that regardless of whether or not the MCAS is a graduation requirement or not.
Carrie, I haven't heard from you in a minute. What do you think of oversight and this question?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. Again, we're talking about the inputs, and we're talking about the standards and how we deliver and all of these things. What we as parents are concerned about are the outcomes, the outputs. There's another test that 10th graders also take that actually makes them a hell of a lot more nervous than the MCAS. It's called the driving test, right? And in no situation, no circumstance would we say, you know what? We are going to make sure we expose kids, 10th graders, 16-year-olds, to really high-quality driver's ed. And we're going to make sure that they have all of the materials, and we're going to have these really strict standards, but we're not going to make them pass a written test or a road test. We're just going to trust that by having really great instructors and really great materials, that they're probably okay. That would be insanity. We would not do that at all. And I would argue, actually, that makes kids a hell of a lot more stressed out. I have an almost 17-year-old. We're going through this right now. So this is how we keep the promise to kids, that we haven't just exposed them to great education, but we have gotten them to proficiency. Because we're not doing kids a kindness if we're not getting them there. Because education has a purpose. And yes, we want our kids to be joyful learners, but our kids aren't going to be able to eat joy if they can't read and they cannot move forward and access economic mobility. If you have a kid who you have decided comes from a poor Black or brown community, and we're going to soften the standards because, oh my gosh, these kids are coming from poverty, or they're poor Black and brown, we're not going to go tough on them because, they're coming from tough economic situations. Maybe they'll go into a trade. You still have to pass a proficiency exam to become an apprentice. You can't walk into the IBEW Local 103 and decide to be an apprentice without taking an aptitude test and showing that you have math skills, reading skills, all of those things. Let alone, if you want to take courses at UMass Dartmouth, you want to go to a community college, you want to talk about a lack of joy? Try going in there and taking a test for placement into a college level course and finding out that even though you have a high school diploma, you have to take 2, 3 remedial courses before you can take an English 101 because you can't place into those. Those are not free courses. You got to pay for those. So I would argue that's actually a tax that we put on poor Black and brown communities because we have to pay for that, because we lie to kids, we lie to parents, we traumatize communities by saying, you know what, you're fine, you're great, you're a joy to have in class, you have a strong sense of social justice. It's okay if you can't read. You know, hopefully you'll be all right. That is not progressive, that is not equitable, and frankly, it's an injustice to all of our kids.
So what you're hearing is that there's differences about what counts as progressive. Peter, it looked like you wanted to respond. What do you think counts as progressive?
I want to say one thing. Nobody on the stage thinks it's okay for kids not to read. Nobody on this stage thinks that. Absolutely. And the reason, and I think that there is an assumption in the logic that Carrie just laid out, that having the graduation requirement improves student achievement. And the fact is that it doesn't. We've had 30 years of data. It doesn't. You can look at scores on, it's something called the Nation Report Card. It's a National Assessment for Education Progress. It's a low stakes exam. So it's actually a good barometer of what students know and can do. For the students who struggle the most, their scores on, it's called NAEP, the Nation's Report Card, have not changed. They have not budged since we made MCAS a graduation requirement. Now, and there's another assumption, I think, in a few of the comments that Ed has made that I also want to unpack with us, which is that a no vote, a yes vote is the end of experimentation or the end of the conversation on the state's graduation requirement. And I actually think I see it the complete opposite way. I think by voting yes, we're saying we need something better so that we know if a student can read or not read. And I love Carrie's driving test analogy because it's perfect. It's actually perfect. In MCIEA, we talk about something called performance assessments, where students demonstrate the knowledge that they're learning in school. And you know what? A great analogy for that is passing a driving test by driving on the road. Now, the bubble tests are showing you can drive by bubbling in answers to questions. And I don't think any of us think that that's the best way to measure whether or not students can drive. In that analogy in and of itself, I think that there is an opportunity for something new. Maybe we can use performance assessments as a way of ensuring that kids can read. And if we vote no, everybody in the legislature is going to wipe their hands and say, we're done. The people have spoken, we're keeping MCAS for another 30 years. If we vote yes, nobody's going to leave the current state system in place where it's just you have to take some civic education courses and physical education courses. There's no prohibition against the legislature coming up with something better. That's not part of the ballot question. And there are going to be committees and conversations just like this one where we come up with something better. And I'm really excited about that future. That's why
So I'm going to go to Ed for the next question, but you may have been thinking of questions yourself while you've been listening to our panelists speak. After this next question, we'll open up the Q&A, so you can start thinking of those questions. If you do have a question, we'll ask that you line up at this microphone here in the center. And just some things to note as you're thinking about your questions. We do ask that it is a question and ends with a question mark. If you want to address one of our panelists specifically, or that they all have a chance to speak on it, that is welcome. So Ed, this last question before we open it up for audience Q&A goes to you. And I know you may want to respond to some of the things that Peter said, but he spoke about a future after MCAS, and you brought that up earlier too. Your advocacy is coming from the Mass Association of Business Leaders for Education, and I got that acronym wrong. I apologize. Can you speak a little bit about, what you see as the future going forward and how students are ready for the workforce, and anything else you want to respond to?
Sure. Let me just say a couple of things. I don't agree. I don't think either of us knows. what happens if a yes vote or a no vote occurs, whether the legislature will do something or not. But I don't think we should roll the dice with our kids' future on that. And so if you want to have a conversation about what it should look like, you've got to have some standard in place, I think, while you change that. Not eliminate it and then we'll talk about it. In fact, Senator Jason Lewis has said he's going to file legislation if the question passes in January. And respectfully, the MTA has not said that they would endorse that. So you can't guarantee that there'll be a replacement. Let's just get rid of it. Of course, we'll replace it. We don't know that. We also, I think, don't know that if there's a no vote, that there won't be some conversation. There were weeks and weeks of negotiations that Secretary Tutwiler had with the Mass Teachers Association and others. And folks really appeared on all sides, I thought, to be looking at some kind of a new system. At the end of the day, the MTA Executive Committee decided against that, and they wanted to go ahead with the ballot question. So I don't think there's a guarantee that if we vote yes, we'll have an opportunity to look at other things. I do, before I will quickly answer your question, but just one other piece. I don't think anybody thinks it is MCAS, the test, that has increased student achievement over the course of the last 3 years. What is different today and over the last 30 years that we didn't have before are high expectations for all students, not just for some. And that has benefited a number of students who in the past were just, the standard was just good enough to get by. Let's just get them across the stage and graduate them, and they weren't ready. Those higher and uniform expectations, along with a sense of urgency that we should all have to get them over that bar and not say, oh, it's just good enough. Go be a Boilermaker, go do something else, right? That has led the combination of quality teaching and student learning that comes with expectations and urgency, I think has created that. And the last thing I'll say with regard to your question, I think we should be open about a system that always looks to evolve. We can measure more than just what we measure with MCAS. There are other states doing some very innovative things. You guys are doing some very innovative things out at the center. There are other states who are adding pieces to the competency determination, earning a credential, having a work-based learning experience. Technology, quite honestly, should, through software, give us the ability to determine over the course of a school year whether a student has achieved a certain standard as opposed to worrying about a one-time test. So I think there's a lot that can happen that we can change. But the answer isn't, let's eliminate what we have now and we'll get to that later. I think we need to have that conversation while keeping in place something that clearly has worked for students.
All right, and with that, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A, so please come forward to the microphone.
I just want to say one thing. So just to keep in mind that these are civil discourses. We are here to learn from each one of these panelists. And thank you so much for your divergent viewpoints. They're great. I think that we just have to make sure that we give them the respect that they deserve when we ask.
Hello. That was louder than I anticipated. All right, so there's been a lot of discussions. I come from a lens of special ed as a special educator. And when we're talking about MCAS and I think of the accommodations my students receive, they don't always align with the accommodations that they need and utilize both in a day-to-day in the classroom, non-formative and summative assessments within the classroom, and when they're adults, because who's going to tell you that you can't use your fingers to remember your twos tables? With that said, is that a fair and accurate barrier to impose to our students with disabilities who are not provided with all of the same accommodations that they would be graduating with without a standardized test that doesn't provide the same number of accommodations and the same level of accommodations needed, that not only are they receiving in the day-to-day classroom, but also they'll be qualified to receive in college and they will be able to use on their own in lives.
So I can speak from my perspective. If there is a student who is not receiving adequate accommodations to
No, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if there's any confusion with my question. No, it's not that they're not receiving adequate accommodations. It's more so, are you familiar with the accommodations provided with the test?
Oh, yes, very much so.
And then first is the accommodations that typically given. So for
Yes.
example, with math, when a lot of my students have access to math manipulatives. That is not an option or filled in multiplication chart, that is not an option. You have a math reference sheet, but it's just a blank multiplication chart that you fill in yourself, which if you don't know your multiplication tables, it's not very helpful. That's more so what I meant, not if they're not receiving adequate accommodations, just the accommodations provided really are not always adequate for students.
Yeah, which is why it is so important that children who have special needs are actually provided with alternative pathways to pass the MCAS, including MCAS Alt, and other ways that they can also demonstrate proficiency. So if we're talking about the 700 kids that aren't able to actually successfully pass the MCAS for a whole myriad of reasons, some of them are English language learners, some of them are children with special needs, to me, when we discover that there are these deficits here, that's actionable information that we need to be doing more to accommodate those kids. We can't take action if we don't have that data. So I think all of that information is really important. I care deeply about those 700 kids. But in the larger context, we're talking about less than 1% of kids who are signaling that they need additional help and support, additional accommodations. We should be taking action, but that is not a call for us to lower the bar for every other kid in Massachusetts by not saying we need to have a bar of proficiency here.
Is it okay if I ask a follow-up question? I'm sorry.
Quickly, go ahead.
So with alternative assessments, you don't qualify for a graduation diploma, you just get a certificate of completion. And to qualify, you need to be identified as having a significant cognitive impairment, which is usually a student who has an IQ well below 70 and is well off a grade level. So those aren't the students I'm talking about. I'm talking about my students who have autism or have like a specific learning disability who are negatively impacted. I don't think that putting them on an alt would benefit them because then they're on a track not to graduate, and I don't want to send that message as being okay. Just more so, is it fair for them? Are we creating unnecessary barriers to graduation for students because the accommodations that we're providing with the state assessment are not appropriate and adequate accommodations that they're receiving in their day-to-day IEPs, and that would then follow them to college with an 504?
So
Let me try. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing. But one of the things that we probably should have gotten to in this, because obviously not only for the audience here, but it recorded, students have 5 opportunities to take and pass the MCAS, which is a 10th grade exam, before they graduate from 12th grade. There are a number of students for whom waivers and alternative pathways are available. They include that 700 students, but if a student has passed their all their other local requirements, if they've passed their courses and the like, and for some reason they cannot pass the exam within those 5 opportunities, there are at least 2 pretty robust pathway opportunities available for them. One is called a portfolio appeal, which a lot of special needs students can take advantage of, where the school helps them put together a portfolio of their work, and they can demonstrate, because they might not be able to pass the test. An independent panel looks at that and determines that they have achieved the standards, even though they haven't passed the test. The other way to do it, and this is one that I think is terribly underutilized, because those 700 students that Carrie mentioned, less than 25% of them had an appeal filed on their behalf, which is really befuddling to me, because they passed their coursework, right? And then were still denied a diploma. If you pass your coursework, if you have a GPA that is equal to a peer cohort of your peers who have passed the exam, you can also be eligible for a waiver. So there are a number of ways to do that. One of the things that Senate President Karen Spilka said when she came out in opposition was maybe we need to require that if students pass their coursework but can't pass the exam, that an automatic appeal is filed on all of their behalfs.
But then doesn't that question the fidelity?
I'm actually going to move us to the next question. Thank you.
Hi. I'm going to try to keep it short because we know I can come up with 17 different things. I definitely want to focus on the parent perspective. So as a parent of 2 very bright kids, one was absolutely built for Common Core math and standardized testing and everything else, right? This year, I got his results 6 months later. Is that reasonable to be able to address learning loss or all these things that you're worried about being able to catch the kids up, right? 6 months later, there's nothing we can do.
Amen.
Not only that,
Yeah.
Not only that, but I get a sheet of paper with a bunch of blocks and numbers and no clue. This year, my daughter, who has test anxiety, but, doesn't have a 504, so doesn't have extended time. In third grade, she was allowed to stay after school to finish her essay. We've worked on essays. We've worked on all those skills, right? She wouldn't have passed. I find this out 6 months later. There is nothing on that paper to show me what we can work on. This is my main problem with using this to, assess the situation, assess the student's needs. I also agree that the accommodations, as somebody who's administered the test, I don't agree that the accommodations, they don't align with what we use in the classroom. I have students with autism. I feel what you're saying, I really do. My students with autism, some of them, their sensory needs, that read aloud, that push a button and a computer reads to you, does not process. I have a student who can't do work on the computer where I'm not doing the work. He's supposed to listen to the instructions. He's supposed to listen to the words and the sounds and all these things, and it hurts his brain. I've seen human read aloud be denied left and right. You talk about alts, okay, but I've seen the district push to get everybody on MCAS in elementary school so they can be exposed to it. I've seen kids in general education classrooms, ABA embedded, kids with ASD, kids across the board stressing.
Is there a way you can wrap this up as a question?
I'm curious to know how MCAS graduation requirements affects what you do when you get those scores 6 months later. What can you do 6 months later?
Listen, you and I are on the same page, and you can ask Commissioner Riley. I was lighting him up on a regular basis, saying it does not make sense to me that in the year of Beyonce 2024, where we're taking tests on computers, that we can't have that data back instantaneously. That's wild to me. And when we poll parents and ask them about standardized testing, which I would actually say, it will surprise you to know that there's more support for standardized testing now after the pandemic than we've ever seen.
No.
It is, and I would also argue, if you don't have to take my word for it, take a look at student participation data in New Bedford. It is literally upwards of 95%. We know
Participation in MCAS?
We know there has been a 20-year campaign by the MTA telling us you can opt your kid out of the test. You don't have to take MCAS. You can write a letter, get it out. 95% participation in this test. Now, that is not like, you don't have to take my word for it. The data
I'm not MTA. I'm not MTA. I'm looking for clarifying here.
Well, you're wearing an MTA t-shirt, so forgive me.
Yes, I'm too.
Okay, I'm going to step in here.
Can I answer the question? So I agree with you on data needing to be actionable. I think it's ridiculous. What we often hear is that the essays have to be graded by a live person. In the age of AI, I think a lot of this stuff we can innovate our way out of so that we do have actionable data to some point. It's not going to be perfect. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not satisfied with MCAS as it is. I don't think it is a perfect instrument. But it is what we have until we evolve into something better, which is why 250 MTA teachers every single year are giving their input and helping to create this test. But that being said, there are other instances as well where we use imperfect data because we need to use what we have until we move forward. Criminal justice being another example, where FBI data is not perfect, right? You don't hear anybody in the criminal justice space saying, well, FBI data doesn't tell us the whole story, so we're going to stop holding racist police departments accountable because we don't think that that test is good enough. And the cops are telling us, well, they're best suited to tell us whether or not they're serving our communities. No. We have to have a data point so that we can hold generationally, institutionally racist systems accountable for underserving communities. And so I would argue with you that, we're not that far apart in terms of being frustrated and not having enough information to do right by kids. But I would also say, based on the data I'm collecting tonight, it sounds like we're having a problem in terms of actually making sure that IEPs have appropriate accommodations for children with special needs in New Bedford. We'd be happy to help you with that, because you're signaling to me,
MCAS
if you
is not
have a child
approving the
who's taking
accommodations
an
that are-
MCAS exam on a computer who is overstimulated, as a mom of a child with autism, there's no way, if that's overstimulating, I would address and have that accommodation written into that IEP that he wouldn't be in that environment.
So I'm going to remind everyone that
We also,
Michelle, I'm sorry.
real quick, we have a half
Michelle,
dozen
I'm
other
sorry.
assessments that go on every day.
Michelle,
Just so you
I'm
know.
sorry. So your opportunity to ask a question is to hear how the panelists would respond. Once they have made their response, that informs us how they've come to their opinion, and it's not an opportunity to debate. I'm going to actually put the same question, the original question there about the data to you, Peter. You're a researcher. The 6-month lag on data, is that something that you think about as a researcher?
I appreciate this question, and I think about this a lot as a researcher. And in case anybody is unfamiliar here, if you're a parent of a kid that's taking the MCAS, you'll get your kid's MCAS scores in the mail 6 months later, and it's an important 6 months because they are in a new classroom, in a new grade level. It spans the summer. And so that is really, really, when we talk about actionable data, I love actionable data. I work with principals across 13 school districts in the state to make action plans based on their data. Now, this is a lot of what I'm talking about when I say that I'm voting yes because I think we can get to a new and better accountability system. Now, very quick overview of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. We use student and teacher surveys to get a sense of the kinds of learning environments and school experiences that students experience in their schools. After folks take a survey, we publish their results on a dashboard 2 weeks later, and it's a publicly available dashboard. Now we're talking about all kinds of different aspects of a student's experience, whether they feel a sense of belonging in their school, whether they have strong relationships with their teachers. I'm a parent as well. I want my daughter and my son to have strong relationships with their teachers. I would know about that 2 weeks later under a better system, not 6 months later, and not when they're in a new classroom. And this is the same is true of performance assessments. If we have teachers that are doing these rigorous performance assessments that are tied to the state standards that aren't going away anyway, and those teachers are sharing their results on, again, an online public dashboard, then there's actionable data there. And that is very different than getting a letter in the mail, like paper mail, 6 months afterwards. So again, I think that there's just a much better way to get to the outcomes that I think we all share.
Thank you. Next question.
My question deals with the issue of credential creep, where jobs that used to require a high school diploma now may require a higher education, which costs time and money. So I'm wondering what role a credential system within a high school can play in helping to solve that problem, because I know it's something that people are finally starting to focus on.
I'll give a quick
Yes,
answer.
go ahead.
There are other states doing more than we're doing here in Massachusetts in terms of incentivizing the giving of industry recognized credentials to students. And in fact, there are states like Colorado and others who actually have it as part of their menu of graduation options, right? So we completely agree with you. Our organizations file legislation that would give, for credentials that are high demand, high wage, $1,000 for every high school who does that. We think we need to see more of that in Massachusetts. A lot of Oak schools do that now, but not every credential that is awarded in Massachusetts high schools is high demand, high wage. But we can do a better job with that. And that's a kind of an example of how we can continue to evolve the system, right? That there are, that we think it's important for every student to be able to achieve a minimum level of academic excellence that allows them to be a lifelong learner and not dependent on a trade or a job, but have the ability to go forward. But we can also add other components to that that help us have the assurance that kids are college and career ready.
Yes, sir.
I'm old enough to be considered part of the Sputnik generation. When the U.S. said, "Oh my God, we aren't educating our kids in science and math. Fortunately, I'm not young enough to be part of the Johnny Can't Read generation, but I'm having some cognitive dissonance here about whether we're talking about individual assessment and credentialing, getting out of high school with a piece of paper, or we're talking about assessment and accountability at the school or district level. So my questions are twofold. One is, if we eliminate the graduation requirement, is there a likelihood that either districts or parents won't bother to encourage the participation, which you say is 95% in New Bedford? So that's one question. The second question is, I'd like, if someone has the data on the effect of the high school graduation requirement on the dropout rate, because there are two groups of people who are not getting high school diplomas. One is those few who complete 4 years or 5 years of high school, take all the classes, but can't pass the test. And the other is the people who don't complete high school because they drop out. And our dropout rate here in New Bedford is still significant. It's a little better than it was, but it's not terrific. Our student growth percentile, which is a complicated statistical measurement of progress of individual students relative to their peers, is very low. Students falling behind, further behind than they were the last time they took a test. So anything which, I guess, to put it as a question, would the change of removing the high school graduation requirement impact in any way the incentive for the district or the oversight of DESE in helping us get a better, more effective, more productive education system, which isn't the same as that individual getting the piece of paper?
So I'm anticipating we'll have different viewpoints on this question. Cindy, I'll give you the chance to answer first, and Ed, I'll go to you next. The incentives that students and educators have with or without the test.
So I have heard this a couple of times, people worried that without the fear, students won't be motivated to learn or take, the test or school seriously. And I feel strongly about responding to this as a professional educator. Educators, psychologists, pediatricians, they will all tell you that motivating a child to learn through fear and punishment is a very bad idea. It comes with significant consequences. We're talking about anxiety. We're talking about destroying a love of learning. Students actually need to feel safe to learn. Part of learning is taking risks and making mistakes. And so it is very scary when I hear people say that, but I know not everyone is a professional educator. That's not necessarily a profession. But listen to the people that do understand human development and learning, and they will tell you that that is not how we should be motivating children. The other, there were many parts to the question. I will answer one more part of the question, and I'm sure others will want to jump in. I heard you say, is the test measuring, you said something about individuals and districts, and I think it's a good point. At this stage to point out to everyone in the room that we know MCAS will remain, and MCAS will continue to give us a snapshot of information about how schools are doing, like entire schools, districts are doing. But we should not be tying a standardized test to an individual's ability to graduate high school. Test developers, they actually consider a standardized test valid when its data produces what we call a bell curve. So if you imagine a graph, right? The distribution of data looks like a bell. In the center, right, where it's highest, you expect the majority of students to do really well, or to do in that, average range. But a smaller percent on the other end to exceed expectations, and then another smaller percent, right, on the opposite side to not meet expectations, to fail. So what I'm saying is that a standardized test is actually designed to maintain failure. This is why they change the test all the time. You guys know this, right? Like they change cutoff scores to maintain this distribution of data. And so it's actually an inappropriate use of a standardized test to tie it to an individual graduation, because what you are then saying is not all students are meant to succeed, because the system is designed to maintain failure. And look at who is disproportionately affected by this system. Our English language learners, our students with education plans, with disabilities, right? Our low-income students of color. And so this is an egregious misuse of the test. The test will remain, right, to give us information about a district and a school. We need to stop tying it to an individual's ability to graduate high school.
Thank you, Cindy. And I think it'll be informative to see how Ed answers this question differently. Ed, how do you feel about the test and it providing incentives for students and the difference between individuals and districts?
Well, it is individual. I mean, we've conflated accountability here a little bit tonight, but this really is about that requirement, because that's all it's on the ballot, right? And we agree that MCAS will still be there, et cetera, et cetera. But it's an individual from a very important perspective. It's not about punishing the individual. It's about ensuring that we get that individual to that standard, over that bar. It's about helping each and every one of those individuals. I hear a lot about how, well, it's just terrible because this is such a high stakes test. You have 5 opportunities to pass it. You have alternatives if you can't pass it. Students who are having to pass a math final or a science final experience the same kind of thing. Is it punitive if they pass that and have to take the course over again? The fact is, the difference between that and this is this is a common assessment. It's shared by everybody. It's not expecting lower outcomes from students. It's not graded differently. It is done that way. In 2003, when it became a graduation requirement, it was administered first in 1998. When it became a graduation requirement, the 10th grade scores shot up like this. It wasn't about fear. It was about students understanding, A, that they needed to take it seriously and that the school needed to help them achieve that. I'm not suggesting a causality here, but dropout rates are lower today than they were at when the requirement went into effect. So the idea that, oh my gosh, this has just driven kids out of high school is not correct either. But I appreciate your question. Thank you.
We have time for one more audience question. I'm going to move us on to the last audience question just for time.
Hi, everybody. Everyone at the front of the room right now knows how they're going to vote. My concern here, and it will end in a question, and I'll keep it under a minute. The people who are watching this at home, the people who are here today, some are not on the fence, some know how they will vote, and some don't. There are many generations in this room just looking around, and everyone has had a different schooling experience. You might think of a teacher that you had when you were younger who made you very happy. The truth is, education has changed. Students' needs have changed. My point in what I'm saying is I am a 6th grade middle school teacher. I teach English language arts. I also teach special education students who English is not their first language and they're learning English right now. I teach students who have severe special needs. As educators, we are responsible, evaluated, meticulously looked over with a fine-tooth comb, how we are supporting these students. Just today, wrapping it up, watch me go. Just today, I'm teaching essay writing. General essay writing. needs
What is the question?
The question is a lot of support. In my classroom today, I had 5 different kinds of graphic organizers, 2 different times where I had to go shoulder to shoulder with students who are on special education plans. They get that much support all year long, me assessing their standards, commonly assessing all around the grade. Is it fair that on one day, 2 days of the school year, that test, the MCAS, that they sit in a cold room for 3 hours, they're not allowed to look, talk, breathe in the wrong direction? We have to monitor when they go to the bathroom. Is it fair for that child who needs all that support throughout the year, gets it, and demonstrates proficiency throughout the year? Is it fair that on that one day, it's a one-size-fits-all if you graduate or not? And that's my question to the board. If you see as a graduation requirement, is one size fits all when we all know every child is different? Is that graduation requirement fair, and does it sit right with you? Thank you.
I appreciate the passion that everyone's bringing. I think that question's been answered. Folks would say on this side of the panel that there's multiple opportunities. Folks on the other side of the panel would say a lot of the things that the question asker said. So I'm going to wrap up the panel with one last question for our panel. You've heard a lot about the specifics of what they think about the MCAS test. You've heard a lot about what goes on in the classrooms and what it means to parents and teachers. As passionate as they all are, it's very clear that they share that passion for making sure students have a good outcome, though they differ on how they believe we should proceed. So my question is very simple. This could go either way. Are you still hopeful about the future of education in Massachusetts? And I am going to ask that you keep it to 1 minute or less. Are you hopeful that Massachusetts is still on a good progress forward, good course forward? And we'll go Cindy down the line and then work towards me.
So I'm incredibly hopeful, even though I will say that families and my colleagues are a bit worried. And they are worried because they aren't naive, and they have said that they understand the influence that the testing industry has on our policymakers and on our leaders in the state. And so they are very concerned, and not just the testing industry, but all of the industries that profit off of the testing industry. So the ed tech giants developing our personalized learning programs like IXL, iReady, that are marketed to schools to boost standardized test scores. The box curriculum that educators are forced to teach from, literally reading from scripts to students, that have been sold to districts to improve test scores. Families and educators are concerned, but why I am hopeful? I am hopeful because look what we've done. We've gotten this question on the ballot. When the working class unites, when educators and families unite, right, we can make change. We can safeguard and protect public education as a public good. We can improve learning for students, especially our marginalized students. So I am incredibly hopeful.
Thank you. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I share the same hopefulness, maybe from a different source. I have a 4-year-old, and it's just impossible to not just be surrounded by hope constantly with my young kids, a 4 and an 8-year-old, at home. I'm hopeful, and it's impossible in this day and age to not balance that out with some concern. We're 2 weeks away from a pretty major election with pretty dramatic consequences. I've seen a trend over the course of the last, 30 or something years, which is that we're living in a more segregated society, right? And I'm concerned about this trend and hopeful, and I'll finish on the hopeful side, but I'm concerned about this trend, and the question factors right in the middle of this because of how important a high school diploma is and how disproportionate the outcomes are. Right? And we talked earlier, it's only about 1% of students who don't pass, but that's still really, really important for that individual student. If that student was here right now, we wouldn't just say, well, it's only 1%. That student's life chances are dramatically affected by it. And when you're talking about assessment, there's a question where it's either the problem's with the test or with the student. And I believe the problem is with the test. Now, if we continue on this path, I think we're going to see accelerating segregation because people won't have the diplomas that they need to enter the workforce and contribute to society. So these things make me concerned, but now the hopeful part, and I'll wrap this up. Conversations like this make me hopeful. Having civil and thoughtful conversation across difference makes me hopeful. Meeting with other parents, talking about what we want in our kids' futures, these sorts of things makes me hopeful because I don't know how we get there, but we can't get there without these types of conversations.
Carrie, are you hopeful?
I have to be hopeful because, as I said, I'm Matthew, Miles, and David's mom, so I have a vested interest in the success of our public education system. But I am worried. There is a reason why the governor, the lieutenant governor, the Senate president, the Speaker of the House, the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts are all voting no on this question. There's a reason. Because while, again, we do take very seriously the opinion of the MTA and why they believe this is important, but there are also real consequences at stake for our children in terms of outcomes. And the purpose of education in context for parents, for families, for communities, for folks like me, I'm a kid that got expelled from school. I have a GED from Boston Public Schools. That's my level of education here. I'm an activist and an organizer. I have seen what it's like to be underserved by a school. I literally come from the generation of kids right before MCAS is a requirement. And I can tell you, there were so many kids that graduated with me from Somerville High School that couldn't get out of the first semester of Bunker Hill Community College, failed to launch, and died of substance abuse, never failed to launch. It was a disaster. Okay, the purpose and the real consequence is an inability to get and access economic mobility, to not be able to compete for the jobs in the economy of the future and compete in a global economy. And that's just what it is. Again, I want my kids to be happy and joyful and stress-free, but it's really stressful if you graduate from high school and you are not proficient in reading, in math, in science, and you never get those jobs and you're stuck in a cycle of poverty. That is not a joyful life and a joyful existence. So for me, this is the real crux of the matter. Yes, our kids are going to have to learn in 10th grade that you have to take a test. You have to demonstrate that you are proficient, that you are ready to go on to the next level. Because you know what? If they want to do anything else, they're going to have to do it too. You want to be a plumber, you want to be a pipe fitter, you want to be an electrician, you want to be a lawyer. You want to be a home health care aide, you want to be a medical assistant, a nurse, a doctor, you're going to have to pass a test and demonstrate proficiency. Are we doing our kids a favor by saying, no, you're never going to have to demonstrate that you actually understand these things? That is not setting our kids up for reality and what they're going to have to face next. And that is part of what we need to do in public education as well, because we are not doing our kids a favor by setting themselves up for failure.
All right, and last and not least, Ed, are you hopeful about the future?
Well, I am. Look, I'm an optimistic person, and I am hopeful. And you know, in addition to the folks that Carrie mentioned, Attorney General Andrea Campbell, the Mass Association of School Superintendents have all come out in opposition, parents, teachers, and others. There's a growing coalition that I think understand that while we can make improvements, we cannot eliminate this requirement with regard to the implications of what that will mean. I'm going to re-quote Secretary of Education Pat Tutwiler, a leader of color, someone who was a high school principal and a school superintendent, particularly in relation to that 1%. He firmly believes that every one of those students should get over that bar. And so the solution isn't to eliminate the standard, but to figure out what we need to do to make sure that all of those students achieve. Not to take away something that has worked for the 90% of students who pass it on the first try and the 96% of students who end up passing. He says, and I agree with him, that the kids who will be harmed most are the kids in the schools that he used to be headmaster of. The kids from black and brown families who are economically disadvantaged, for whom we will lower expectations and say they just can't get there. I understand the fairness issue, but the fact is it's not fair to pass kids along and tell them they're ready for the future if they can't achieve that particular standard. And I think that's what our goal should be. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that regardless of what happens, we have figured a lot of things out here in Massachusetts. And we put some things in place 30 years ago that have been to the great benefit of students and the Commonwealth. And we'll figure it out. There are improvements that we can make. And I think people are of good faith, and we'll get there. But let's hopefully have that conversation while we have something in place that has worked. If we want to improve it, let's do that. Let's not throw it out and then just kind of hope that it will be replaced with something else, because right now the ballot question doesn't replace that graduation standard with anything. Thank you.
Please give our panelists a round of hands. If you have any further questions, I'm sure they'll stick around to answer any questions that you may have. I'll just wrap up this session by saying thank you for coming out. The New Bedford Light is a community organization hosting this for free. I will note that this conversation has been among adults, and if you would like to get students involved in this conversation, we currently have a student essay contest. Students can enter that contest to win publication on the New Bedford Light and also a prize of up to $100. That conversation that goes on among adults, we want to encourage among the youth as well. So thank you for coming out. I encourage you to spread the word about that essay contest and continue this conversation in your own communities. One last round of a hand. Round of applause for that. Thank you very much.